Next, we have the repeated pleasure to bring up Dr. Feliciano. He's going to talk to us about terrorism today. We all call him Dr. Feliciano, but of course in Atlanta, he's known as the boss. So thank you, boss.
You're welcome. Apropos what happened yesterday in France, we're going to talk about what is terrorism and terrorists. And we're going to focus on the ways that terrorists can actually harm people. And most of the talk will be a primer on bombings, which is for reasons that I'll mention. This is a definition from the dictionary. It's the use of violence and threats to intimidate or coerce. Another way to look at it, and this is a quote from 1997, is look at the last sentence, how true this is. It is also theater and draws its strength from its audience. If we didn't have the communication methods that we now have, terrorism would not be on the pages, front pages every day, on the TV 24 hours a day. It wouldn't be as enticing to young men to participate. The purpose of terrorism in any country is to make the law unworkable, try and create a climate of collapse so that the government looks weak. And as many of you know from the wars we've been involved in the United States, it's often a marker of guerrilla activities, but the bottom line is to destabilize a society so that others can take over at some point. I think one of the things people really forget is that terrorism's been in the papers a lot the last couple of years. You can go back about 25 years. You know, an individual was stopped at Canadian Customs, as some of you remember, in 1993, with enough ricin to kill 30,000 people. The Tokyo subway attack in 1995 again killed only 12 people. The lay press reported there were 5,000 casualties from the release of this toxic gas. In truth, it was probably closer to 50. And the Israelis have been dealing with this, as many of you know, for 25 plus years, with all the bombings and buses and bus stops and whatnot in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. This is not a new problem. It's just that we're all more aware of it again because of the press and media. I always call terrorists cowards. I don't think it takes very much fortitude to pick up an automatic weapon and shoot unarmed people. I think they're given way too much credit. And these are young, unemployed males with nothing else to do. Many of them are very impressionable, not being educated. And for many of them, it appears to be the power of taking a life rather than the political goals that their leaders aspire to. These are bad people. Let's just, everybody needs to say it. The papers need to say it too. So let me give you some examples. I mean, the thing that happened on 9/11 is unlikely to happen again, but there were this pointed to a lot of weaknesses in our system to prevent these kind of terrible attacks. And there are really three kinds of terrorism that theoretically could injure a lot of people simultaneously. And these are as listed: the biologics, the chemicals, and then the bombings, again, that I'm going to focus on. There are a whole series of bacteria, rickettsia, viruses, and fungi, that'll create a lot of havoc in a human being if you can get the material into the human being. There are terrible things from the past, like the plague. There's the classic botulism. There's anthrax. We don't see much of this, nor any of these. We don't see attacks with smallpox, tularemia, Ebola, but they're all theoretic biologic weapons, because if they get widespread in a population, they can kill thousands of people within a week or so. And we'll talk more about why that doesn't occur. There are also chemical weapons that have been known for years that have been used in some terrorism attacks and probably used in the bombings in Syria and other places. And you can read some of these. The letters after the names are the chemical designations that you'll read about in most of the terrorism literature. But there's cyanide, which is instant death, all the nerve agents, such as the sarin that was used in the Tokyo attack. There are agents that'll cause acute pneumonia. Ricin is incredibly toxic. causing hemorrhage in the respiratory and GI tracts. And then there are chemicals that just cause a lot of blistering in the skin, in other words, a major burn. So everybody recognizes we have all the possibilities of these attacks, but they're extraordinarily rare because nobody's figured out how to get it to the victims. I mean, how do you produce, gallons and gallons of Ebola and then figure out a way to drop it out of a plane so it doesn't all evaporate in the first 2 seconds and distribute it? I mean, you can't be flying over an American city dropping droplets and not have somebody notice. So what the general theory in the terrorism literature on why we don't have more attacks with biological and chemical weapons is it's logistic problems. It's just hard for a terroristic group to figure out how to produce and or aerosolize and or distribute these. So what we end up with is a really simple thing that any one of you can do on your own in your home, if you like, using the internet as a guide. How simple is it to make a damn bomb that kills a lot of people? I'll give you a little primer though on bombs. When a blast goes off, the air around the blast gets compressed, and I'll show you a picture of this in just a second. And there's actually a blast wave that flows out from the bomb that is really compressed air. It's a very high pressure phenomenon, which may not mean much to you if you're not a physicist, but I'll show you what the effects are if you're close to this blast wave in just a couple of minutes. If you look carefully at this photo from a military textbook showing the flames and whatnot of the bomb, but if you see that penumbra around that, that is this high pressure blast wave that is the compressed air around the explosion itself. And it's that kind of thing that will get to the victims quicker than the flames or other things. There's sort of a backlash after that. There's a slower moving area, which is actually below atmospheric pressure. So if you look on a curve, if you will, of a blast wave, you see this very quick high pressure zone. And then all of you have seen the movies, the atomic bomb, right? The tests, and you see the trees go one way and then the trees go the other way. That's this low pressure part of the blast wave. Now, why do you die in a bombing? Well, there are three things that will contribute to your death. One is obviously the size of the explosive, because if the peak of the wave is incredibly high, it's got a lot of kinetic energy in it. How long the wave hits you is obviously a factor. It's been recognized for many years that if you bomb in a closed space, that's worse than an open space. If you bomb a group of people in the water, it's horrible because the waves get carried in a different way, as I'll show you. And obviously one of the most critical factors in whether you get injured and how severely you get injured is the distance from the bomb, from the explosion to the victim. This is a little busy, but this is a report of casualties in Northern Ireland during the terrorist years, and looking at the size of the charge, how big was the bomb over to your left, and then 3 columns looking at the distances away. And if you're close, even if it's a low charge, you're going to have trouble. And then all the other things make sense. The bigger the bomb, the more likely you're going to have critical injuries. But once you're greater than 16 meters away, you're probably going to escape unless a piece of shrapnel hits you. The other way to look at bombs is they create a tremendous pressure per square inch. And you can just measure all of these. And what's frightening is as you get up to some of these higher PSIs, when patients really start having severe injuries, I'll remind you that 80 PSI can probably knock a brick wall over. So it's not surprising that if there's a lot of pressure generated in this blast wave, you can kill people. And again, a lot depends on the magnitude of the charge. You can see the date on the slide. I mean, this has all been studied for years. This is not new news. There is sort of a 1 meter rule in bombings. This is particularly true in civilian bombings because the military has such greater power with their bombs. But victims within 1 meter, right next to the bomb, are often evaporated by the explosion. The blast wave just disintegrates all the tissue. Amputation is a very bad sign in a victim of bombing because it suggests they've been very, very close to the bombing. And it's a marker of many other injuries they will probably have. And the reason in trauma centers we don't see 1 million people after every bombing is because people in proximity to the bomb die from pulmonary rupture or traumatic brain injury or things like that. So this is a terrorist in Israel. This is a self-blown up bomb. And you can see that basically the body parts are disintegrated from the force of the explosion. Again, it's pressure per square inch. It's tremendous kinetic energy. There's fire and other things, as I'll tell you. This is another terrorist. These slides were given to me by Mickey Stein, who's a good friend, who was the trauma director of the entire Israeli Defense Force. And this is a bomber, a terrorist who wore his explosives around his trunk so that when he initiated the explosion, his body disintegrated from his neck down to his knees. So when you're right in the middle of an explosion and there's enough power in it, it does actually disintegrate or amputate patients. There's another individual with a leg blown off. It's very interesting if you go back and look at the data from Ireland, how many of the patients with traumatic amputations did very poorly because, again, it was a marker, as I said, of other injuries. If you're not immolated or disintegrated by the bomb, most of the literature describes the 4 ways you can get injured by the bomb if you're a little further away. There is, of course, the blast wave that I just mentioned. There is the debris. I mean, most terrorists put shrapnel, anything in the bombs. Thirdly, patients get pushed into other objects, so they have like blunt trauma from a car crash. And then there's a 4th degree of injury, which is basically the heat and fire. So if you're close to a bomb, there are a lot of ways you can get injured or die. These primary blast injuries, again, are from the blast wave that I mentioned to you, where you get this really compressed air ring, if you will, that strikes and hits the body. This can create a lot of local disruption, and in certain areas of the human body, the ears, the lungs, and the GI tract, where there's fluid, you get a phenomenon known as spalling, which is a lot of disruption in the organs that I just mentioned, where fluid and air come together. Again, the fluid really accelerates a lot of these processes. If you take spalling in the ears, many victims who are close to a bomb have their eardrum ruptured. Some of them have damage to the middle ear. And permanent hearing loss, this is something they found out in Iraq and Afghanistan as well, is incredibly common depending, again, how far you are from the bomb. It's interesting just in following a lot of these victims that if they survive, they do not necessarily have to have their eardrums fixed, because even though it's a blowout, it can seal again without medical therapy. The primary blast injury with spalling in the lung is a disaster. You get microhemorrhage in the alveoli. These patients often have respiratory distress and a lot of infiltrates. As I'll show you, they rupture alveoli, they get a pneumo, they get venous air embolism, they get perivascular and peribronchial disruption. This is a victim of a bombing who obviously has a primary blast injury to the lung. There's just an acute, severe hemorrhage throughout the lung that's going to create respiratory distress. These are from laboratory experiments in animals. You can see the hemorrhage into the lung up in the micrograph there. You can see the large hematomas in the lung. And these are all characteristic of lung injury. Spalling in the GI tract creates the same thing as in the lung. You get all this hemorrhage into the wall, some of it extending into the mesentery. One of the things the Israelis found is that if you have free air in the abdomen in the victim of a bombing, it may not necessarily mandate operation because some of it dissects down from alveolar rupture in the lung. There are, however, with mesenteric hematomas, some late small bowel and colon perforations. These are really hard to see, and I'm just going to skip over them. Secondary blast injury is from shrapnel. When we took care of the victims of the bombing at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, we have pictures of many of the victims with pieces of shrapnel. We had one embedded in the brain of a victim from England. We had the clip that held the bag. It was like a canvas bag. We had the clip of the bag embedded in the jaw of another patient. And it's really, debris is either the fragments of the bomb and or any enclosed shrapnel, much of which is nails, as you know. And then any other debris from other objects that have been blown up by the blast. We found this to be a big deal in Atlanta because a lot of the victims were far away from the bomb, but ended up with shrapnel causing nerve injuries, humerus fractures, brain injuries. The one death we had in Atlanta of a young woman was a transcranial piece of shrapnel. So you're not safe, being 16 meters away. It just means the injuries are going to be different than you'd get with the primary blast. These are some classic examples. Shrapnel in the brain, nails all over the place, shrapnel in the chest. And this just goes on all the time. It really increases the number of casualties, particularly, again, if they're far from the area of the bomb. Tertiary blast injury, again, is like a car crash. The patient gets hit by the shock wave and gets thrown somewhere and bumps into something, if you will. I mean, it's pretty impressive. A good-sized bomb can cause an acceleration of 15 Gs in an average-sized adult. And what that means is it's equivalent to going up in space in a rocket. That's a lot of Gs. And you get the classic blunt injuries that we see in motor vehicle crashes, which are either deceleration and or compression. The last way you get injured by bombings and terrorist attacks is from burns and the explosion itself. When you have explosive gases go off, the acute heat change can reach 3,000 degrees centigrade. I'm sorry. They've had a field day calling me today from home. But it's a very brief thing. It's much like you see in explosions, the white hot fire and then a lot of smoke. In Mickey Stein's series of casualties in Israeli civilian bombings, about a third of the victims had burns because they were in enough proximity to be caught with a quaternary blast injury. This is an interesting report on injuries and severe injuries in 636 people who survived casualties from suicide bombings. And I want you just to look at the middle column and what causes most of the injuries in civilian bombings if you're not killed, if you're not right in proximity to the bomb. And it's really the secondary mechanism that I just touched on a second ago. It's the shrapnel. Once you're beyond the 10 or 15 meters or so, the other mechanisms are much less common. So that's what you look for. You have to really screen the whole patient with CAT scanning or x-rays to look for any embedded debris. So in summary, bombs are easy to make. They're very dramatic. When you have a large crowd of people, not necessarily like last night, but in some of the other terrorist attacks in Europe, it's easy to kill and maim a lot of people. So it's just a perfect vehicle for terrorism. And just to reiterate, there are really different ways you get injured with the bombings. If you're in proximity, you're either going to be immolated, disintegrated, or amputated. And then the 4 types of injuries that I mentioned from blast. Just on a philosophical note, I think everybody's sort of aware that with the immigrant problem in Europe, it is anticipated, and their poor integration in the European society, this is going to go on for another quarter of a century. I mean, this is going to be a daily occurrence. And I think the fond hope in the United States is that we have integrated our immigrants so much better that we will not have as many of these attacks, but we will surely have attacks. So terrorism is here to stay. The people who participate in it are cowards. They're uneducated males. And I do hope something can be done about the background of many of these people. Thank you very much.
Any questions from the floor? I'll ask a question, Dr. Feliciano. So, your last sentence there was, I hope something can be done. I guess that's really the question. What do you foresee as potentially helpful?
I think it's a political and religious problem that is so great that until the leaders of the groups involved in this kind of stuff get their heads on straight about what they're actually doing, I think we're stuck with this. I mean, every conflict around the world for 100 years has had terrorism. I mean, the Israelis, as you know, actively participated in terrorism to get rid of the people involved, or the people who had, taken over Palestine and stuff. So I don't think we're going to escape this. I do think there are a lot of protective mechanisms in the U.S., but we're talking about changing an entire religion, and that's not something I want to go into.
Question, yeah.
Stuart Lacey, Phoenix. Is there anything different that we as trauma health professionals should do system-wise, to prepare for these types of mass injuries as opposed to the mass injuries we're more used to thinking of, like plane crashes and bus crashes, et cetera?
Yeah, great question. What you want to do in civilian attacks like this is distinguish between multiple casualty events, which is what most civilian bombings are, and mass casualty events. The words get interchanged and it's wrong. A mass casualty event is an earthquake in China that kills or injures 400,000 people. That's beyond any medical scope, right? All the urban bombings around the world for the past 50 years have been multiple casualty events in cities with a lot of resources, and outside resources are rarely needed. I mean, we had everybody at the Olympic bombing evacuated within 32 minutes. 4 of the downtown hospitals took care of all the patients. Your real question, though, is what can the medical community do? First thing, you probably ought to have a team that can go to the scene and do triage. Because what happened at Grady happens often, and that is most of the casualties are taken to the primary trauma hospital. That includes bad and not so bad casualties. So the trauma center gets overwhelmed quickly. If you do some field triage, you can say this is a leg shrapnel injury, send it to this community hospital, et cetera, et cetera. So field teams is a consideration. What happened in Atlanta with the Olympic bombing is there were so many doctors and nurses in the Centennial Park, just with their families and all, that they did triage. And they certainly moved some of the lesser injured patients away from the trauma center. The second thing you need to do is to review with your surgeons and your emergency room staff how you're going to handle an urban disaster like this. One of the things we found in Atlanta is if you assign one surgeon or one senior surgical resident to each badly injured patient, it works like a charm, because surgeons are like pit bulls. And what we did was, I tell the chief resident, this is your patient. If the patient needs a CAT scan, you arrange it. If the patient needs a laparotomy, you do it. Instead of having this, let's have a team concept that I keep hearing. If you put a pit bull dog on each patient, they get great care. The third thing is you need to have surge capacity. If you're a level 1 or level 2 trauma center and you're going to suddenly get 50 casualties in your emergency room, you have to have a place where to send the people who are in the emergency room already, or the inpatients upstairs if you need those beds. You need surge capacity agreements with the other hospitals in the region. There are a lot of things trauma professionals can do to make these events go better. Just go to Israel and talk to them. I mean, they have the houses rebuilt, the stores reopened, the sidewalks cleaned in a day. They will not let this ruin their society. They're terrified of it, but they know how to handle it. And we're going to have to learn to do the same thing. Thank you.